Okay, let's try this again. Apologize once again to those of you who are here at 11:30 when we were trying to do this first time. Tech difficulties sometimes happen. Andrew Ellis, Jeremy Birmingham, this is Talking Stuff on the podcast. We are seemingly on track here as normal. So again, Andrew, like breaking down the last week, the highs and lows of recruiting seem to be higher than ever and lower than ever right now for Ohio State fans as you go back and forth between like a really good day like the Aaron Scott commitment or the Justin Scott commitment, and then very bad days like the Dylan Stewart decision and the KJ Bolden decision. Is this not just part of what recruiting is? I mean, is there, do you believe, too strong a perception that Ohio State should land every player it offers? Or are we at a point now where we should understand that in the world of recruiting, like this is much different than it's ever been before, and the old rules are out the window and everyone's trying to figure out what makes sense with the new rules?
I mean, yeah, it's been a roller coaster ride the last week, 2 weeks, whatever you want to say, actually really dating back through all of July. But all of what you said is true. I think all of those things are accurate. It is the new world of college football recruiting with NIL and the transfer portal and all of that stuff. But it's also become a bit of a concern because the ups and downs of Ohio State recruiting has been especially obvious on the defensive side of the ball. And it was the last cycle. It's going on again this cycle. There's definitely some concern among the fan base, myself included. I think if you want to be an optimist, you look at the class as a whole and you see a couple of truly elite position groups, quarterback, wide receiver, of course, cornerback now up in that category with the addition of Aaron Scott. But then you've got these other position groups like edge rusher and safety, and there's a lot of work to be done, especially after missing on two of the very, very top of the board targets. So yes, it's a problem. Yes, it's concerning. But part of it is just big boy recruiting against the Georgias, Alabamas, and apparently the Florida States and South Carolinas of the world. So
right. And I think that's what makes this frustrating for people more than anything else. Like there is a part of your Ohio State fandom, I think, that if KJ Bolden were to have decided on Georgia on Saturday night, it's easier to swallow, right? But at the same time, Georgia is trying to play the recruiting game the same way that Ohio State is. And so they have to deal with the fact that they just lost a player from their backyard from 60 minutes away to Florida State. And in the same token, they lost Caleb Downs a year ago. They lost Justice Haynes a year ago. They're likely to lose Edric Houston in 2 weeks to Ohio State or Alabama or Clemson. So like, they're not freaking out. And is that because they have the ability to just recruit the South easier? And so you can more easily replace guys like this? Is Ohio State, putting itself in too small of a box as it recruits kids? Because the fact is Ohio State is trying to pluck the guys in the South that make the most sense for the Ohio State program, the guys that they think are going to be interested in something more than just NIL. And so it's a very select process, because if you just, shotgun approach it and fire and hit as many people as you can, you're going to get kids that aren't really matching up with what you want the program to be. But at the same token, the kids who you're approaching, like KJ Bolden, who you recruit for 2 years, whose mother is Perry Eliano's cousin, who is playing a huge position of need, is a guy at a position that Ohio State will have early playing time for. Like, you still swing and miss, and because ultimately all of the things that you think are important and that kids and their families are saying are important, at the end of the day, in those last 3-day push, that 72 hours to commitment date, all go out the window, and it all becomes just a bidding war. And the fact is, and I saw a lot of people on Twitter and on the OhioState.Rivals.com message board, and like, oh, Ohio State didn't even make the final three. Like, that's BS. That's just BS. There comes a point in these conversations when a player says this is what it's about, and Ohio State says, okay, well, this is our best and final, and we're out if this isn't enough. And so then it becomes a matter of, well, these other teams are still willing to entertain or go above that offer. So like, people are frustrated, understandably, because there is a belief, and there has been a belief from Ohio State for the last 6 weeks, and more specifically in the last 3 weeks, that this was a two-team battle between Ohio State and Florida State. And once Ohio State says, hey, we're out of this bidding war, then anybody who's willing to be in the bidding war becomes the final three. Does that, like, I don't think that will make anyone feel better about the quotes, but the reality is the quotes don't matter. Quotes are generally at this point just BS from kids and their families who are trying to say the right things because no one wants to just come right out and say, well, it was about how much money we were getting, because that feels disingenuous, even though everyone understands that it's true.
Yeah, and I get what you're saying. I think the concern among the fan base is we've talked so much about NIL being in a better place than it was a year ago, which is absolutely true. With 1870 and everything that's going on, it's just more of a cohesive group of collectives, I guess. But we said that, and then you see situations where a guy like a Marquise Lightfoot, Ohio State, not willing to really up the ante, so to speak, on that one leading up to his announcement. And then you say, well, maybe that makes sense because then they know they're going to have to perhaps up the ante a bit for a guy like Dylan Stewart. And then we see Dylan Stewart commit to South Carolina a week ago. And those are the types of situations that are frustrating for the fan base. And I get what you're saying about the quotes, KJ Bolden telling somebody that Ohio State wasn't in his final three or final four or whatever. And I don't know if I'm buying that. But, and I was going to say this to the end, but I think just there's a very real concern among, for me at least, does the coaching staff, are they able to really have a pulse on some of these recruitments the way that they need to? And yeah. I don't know, it's a problem. And I know with NIL and everything going on, it's just hard to get a pulse in those situations, but it's been problematic now for 2 cycles in a row, especially at certain position groups.
Yeah. And I think this is one of those unfortunate situations where multiple things can be true. Ohio State is willing to entertain and be much more aggressive in the NIL space than ever before, but they are still also not willing to make a college freshman, or at this point, a high school soon-to-be senior, a higher paid player than anybody on the Ohio State roster. And it's what I wrote about on Saturday night. If you have to choose next year at Ohio State between having an incoming freshman, KJ Bolden, or a returning junior, Sonny Styles, who you have to find a way to make sure he gets his just due in the NIL space, which one do you take?
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty easy conversation.
Right. Now, the problem is that you have to find a way to have people on your depth chart behind Sonny Styles, right? So there is going to be a decision for Ohio State to make at some point. Like, yes, you want to stand firm in your belief that there's no way a high school senior should be making more money than every player on your roster. Okay, period. But at the same token, you keep losing these players, and eventually you're not going to have the concerns about how much you're paying your current players because they're not going to be good enough to warrant that sort of discussion. So I get it. Beyond that, your second point about the coaches perhaps feeling a bit naive at this point, I completely agree with. But I also ask, if if a player and his family is telling you we are in, and then they go back home and start shopping around, it's not like Ohio State stops recruiting them at that point. They're still engaged. They're still talking to them. They're still saying, hey, I thought you said you were in. This is what we agreed on. This is where things are. We're willing to budge a little here. We're willing to budge a little there. But when it gets to a certain point and it becomes clear that people are only interested in raising that bar in the NIL front, then you have to have a line that you are not willing to cross, don't you? Because otherwise, like, when does this stop? And I think this is the hard part, because Ohio State wants to compete at the highest level and will compete at the highest level, but they're also, more so than any of the teams they're really recruiting against in this space, like, dug in with their heels to try to stop it. Like, Ohio State won the Justin Scott recruiting battle because they are willing to play NIL more aggressively than Notre Dame and Michigan and other teams in the Midwest. And this is something I said a year ago. Like, there is a problem in the Midwest. There is a belief in the North, and this ties into things that we're building out with Doug Maurice on the podcast. Like, there is a different mindset between the North and the South about what is right and what is wrong and how you're supposed to be. And this holier than thou idea that, like, well, we're just not going to cross this line in the North, is hurting the entire region's football. And at some point, it will eventually hurt it enough that you will have no choice but to walk across that line or retreat entirely. And I think that, at the risk of sounding like hyperbolic or making this into an anthill into a mountain, like, that day is coming a couple years from now if Ohio State isn't willing to get there. But in the meantime, you still have to look at it and say, well, they do have the number 2 ranked class in the country. They do have 3 really good corners, 2 really good linebackers. They got a 5-star defensive tackle. They're still absolutely the front runner for 5-star defensive end Edric Houston. They're not out of it for Marquise Lightfoot. They're not out of it for Zaquan Patterson, even though I don't think he's leaning at all towards Ohio State right now. Like, there's still time to fix things, but you now try to fix things heading into the season where your focus is much different and you're not able to give recruiting the full attention that it probably deserves.
Yeah, I don't know. Like, I'm just thinking this KJ Bolden situation. Like, let's just say he leaves his official visit weekend. Hypothetically, let's just say he commits to the staff on that Sunday when he leaves, which gives them optimism, of course, which gives people like you optimism. And then I from that time to yesterday, like, what has changed? Obviously, like you said, looking at other schools, visiting other schools, other offers, that kind of thing. But is there, and I really hope this isn't the case, but is there some kind of an issue with the staff, like communication after that point? I can't imagine Perry Eliano, who's a family member, would just sit around and twiddle his thumbs after, getting a silent commitment, because we all know that those don't really mean much in general, and just let that relationship, plummet from that point. I don't know if that's led to anything here. I don't know. And I hate comparing everybody to Brian Hartline because he's just the best of the best at what he does. But like last year, Carnell Tate, different case, he was committed, but he can go and take all these visits to Tennessee and have Tennessee, pay whatever, shopping trips, whatever the hell is going on there. And like, it doesn't mean anything. Like, there was really never any doubt that that's going to end up in Ohio State's favor. And maybe it's just because that's Brian Hartline and that's a different position group. But I don't know. Maybe the expectations are too high for certain positions. Or maybe this is just the world we're living in now.
No, I mean, but even as good as Brian Hartline is, here we are a week away from a decision from Jeremiah McClellan, who everyone in the world expected in April. He visited Ohio State. All of a sudden, all of the future casts and crystal balls and all those things went to Ohio State. And there's a reason why that happens, folks. It's not because people just all of a sudden decide, well, you know what, today's a good day to do this. People they hear certain things. We're told certain things. And so then those things come in accordingly. But now here we are 4 months later, 5 months later, and you're wondering, like, is he going to choose Missouri because they're going to give him a lot more money and because Missouri can give it to him right now because of the way their state NIL is structured? Is he going to pick Oregon because they've offered him even leaps and bounds more than Missouri did and far more than Ohio State did? Is this Ohio State being cheap? Is it Ohio State being stubborn to say, well, you know what? Here's where we feel you fit. This is our valuation of you. We don't care about websites and what they think your valuation is. Or is it Ohio State being naive and not understanding that someone's value is whatever someone is willing to pay them? And so, like, there is a battle that they're going to have internally between, do you cross that line now or do you cross it 3 years from now? Because it's coming one way or the other, in my opinion. And even someone as good as Brian Hartline, like, the conversations with Jeremiah Smith are ongoing. Like, there's not going to be a stop. If you think Florida State or Florida is going to, back off now that they've seen what happens if you can just throw out an inordinate amount of money that you don't necessarily have to pay because you could just make promises and if they work out, great. If they don't, the kid's already wasted his career. Like, that's where you're at. And so I don't know that there's a clear answer, but I think that it's telling that the creme de la creme, the elite programs in the country, the Ohio States, the Alabamas, the Georgias, the Clemsons, are all trying to do this the same way. And then you see the upstarts, the ones that are trying to get back into relevancy, are pushing the envelope in a way to make those schools feel like they have to go outside of their comfort zone. And I guess time will tell how effective that is, but it's a weird situation. And I was pretty adamant on Twitter on Tuesday after Dylan Stewart committed to South Carolina. Like, he did not commit to South Carolina because of NIL. So what you're asking, like, is the coaching staff not following up? Is it not being aggressive enough? Is it not? I think in some cases that's true. I don't think that's the case in the KJ Bolden situation. I know for a fact how often Ohio State was in contact with KJ and his family. I don't know that that's the case with Dylan Stewart's recruitment. Dylan Stewart is a much different type of kid than KJ Bolden, much less communicative, much less conversational. And because Larry Johnson himself is already, someone who doesn't like to blow kids' phones up that much. I mean, I think that there is a chance you could say maybe those two didn't talk as much as you would like, but I know that wasn't the case for the head football coach at Ohio State. I know he was in contact with the parents and that sort of stuff. So, there is a divide here somewhere, and some of it I truly believe, if you look at the coaching staff at Ohio State on offense versus defense, the offensive staff does look to be a touch younger and a bit more aggressive and a bit more modern when it comes to the recruiting age, and that is indisputable. So the defensive staff, which again, I think if you look around the country, and this is a Ryan Day issue, the staff alignment at Ohio State is significantly different than anywhere else. You only have 4 full-time defensive coaches. Perry Eliano is younger, and Tim Walton isn't like an old head, but these are guys that handle things a different way, an old school way. Then you have someone like James Laurinaitis helping on that front. But until he's a full-time coach, which Ohio State needs to damn well make sure happens next season some way or another, or you risk losing James Laurinaitis, then until there's a defensive alignment issue or changes at that spot, I don't think you're going to see a different approach from the coaches themselves. So the approach has to be different from the Ohio State administrative side, the NIL collective side, but that is still being informed and instructed essentially by Ohio State's opinion of what these kids are worth. So it's just a back and forth.
Yeah, and you mentioned the wide receiver situation. I think if obviously Ohio State's got 2 studs already in the fold with Jeremiah Smith and Mylon Graham. If Jeremiah McClellan commits to Oregon or Missouri 1 week from today, I think myself and everybody else who follows this stuff will still have the utmost confidence that Brian Hartline goes and lands somebody like Chance Robinson that they just offered last week, who's committed to Miami. I think the problem right now, as we said here today, is just where are they going to turn with the safeties? And you mentioned Zaquan Patterson earlier. It seems like Miami, Michigan, and maybe like an Auburn or someone like that.
Florida State's a big one in that one as well.
Yeah, of course. It just doesn't seem like Ohio State's got a ton of traction on that one. He doesn't seem close to making a decision from what I saw. But there just aren't a lot of options out there at safety right now. And they've got one committed in Jalen McLean, who's a very good player and a top target of theirs. But they need 2 more in this class. And the pickings are getting kind of slim right now.
Yeah, this is the crux of the issue. In a year where Ohio State desperately needs defensive ends and safeties, if you look across the nation, it is a weak class at defensive end and safety. So those guys, those elite players, those Dylan Stewarts, those KJ Boldens become that much more vital, that much more important. And you have everybody going at them as hard as they possibly can and not really divvying up the pot. If you look at Georgia, for example, they are in desperate need of safety this year as well. And they just had Jalen Hayward decommit. You lose KJ Bolden, you're almost certainly going to end up losing Peyton Woodyard at some point to USC, in my opinion. They're in just as weird a spot as Ohio State is on that front. So everybody's fighting the same battle. Zaquan Patterson is a really good player. Ohio State had him up to visit in June, had a good visit. The plan is for an official visit to happen this summer. But this is one of those situations where, if I tell people what I actually hear, then I get accused of being negative. But Ohio State does not feel like they have any real shot at Zaquan Patterson at this point. It's not because they've slow played it. It's just because the family's not that interested for whatever reasons. Not every kid loves Ohio State. So you do the best you can to get into the fight. And then you hope that you can get the kid up in the fall for an official visit and go from there. But obviously this is frustrating to fans because you see a guy like Coy Beasley in Ohio, who some people have as a top 100 prospect committed to Purdue, but he's not a safety. I mean, I don't care what he's listed at. He's 5'10". I know he runs really fast. He's a sub 4.4 guy, electric speed. If Ohio State, after 2 years of watching him, doesn't think he's a good enough football player to play at Ohio State, then they'll be proven wrong or right. And if that's an evaluation issue, then there's another layer that Ohio State has to figure out, because someone is making these decisions. But it starts with the scouting department. They're watching these kids, and then the coaches have to decide themselves, hey, do I think that this kid is worth pursuing, even if, the recruiting / scouting department doesn't? So like, it's not that black and white in all these cases. People will point to Reggie Powers and say, well, okay, well, Ohio State offered him, but then decided to back off. Yeah, now he's committed to Michigan State. Will they go after him? I don't know. Is he the same player as KJ Bolden? Not even close. It's not the same type of prospect, not the same type of position that KJ, from what I understand reading around on Sunday morning, like, is heading to Florida State with the idea that he's playing cornerback. So is that different? I mean, is that part of the problem? I don't know exactly how you fix these issues, but you can't just take players that you don't think are as good that early unless you're Michigan, right? And then you end up dropping those kids in November, the Jim Harbaugh way. But heck, it could be worse, right? For Ohio State fans, like, Michigan's recruiting run in the last 3 weeks of last month has been significantly worse than Ohio State's. Don't you think? Let's look for the silver lining here. It could be worse.
Losing your top wide receiver target to Boise State, kind of a tough look, I guess. But I don't know, this safety thing, it's you talked about the guys that they think are talented enough to play at Ohio State, and it just seems like the list of guys that they feel that way about is dwindling by the day. I don't know, like, I was looking just through the top safety rankings the other day, and besides Patterson, who, like you said, doesn't seem like a realistic option right now, I don't know what they're going to do. Maybe somebody will emerge and blow up during their senior season, or maybe they'll reevaluate Coy Beasley and kind of change their thoughts on him. I don't know, but something's got to give, because it's one of the most important positions in this class. And right now it's Perry Eliano is kind of on the struggle bus right now.
Yeah. You have 9 safeties on the roster, but I think, 4 of them, maybe 5 of them are seniors. You're only going to have Sonny Styles for one more year after this one. So it's not like you have a whole lot of room. You're obviously going to be aggressive in the transfer portal and try to find someone there. But the truth of the matter for Ohio State is that you've got to find someone in this class. So one name I would look at is Brandon Jacob, who's committed to Maryland from Florida. He visited unofficially in the summer. Like, Ohio State does like him quite a bit. He came up with Kai Bates, who committed to LSU, the cornerback. So, he's committed to Maryland. You figure that's one maybe you can win, understanding now that you might have to over allocate in the NIL spot for him. But the reality here is that the state of Ohio, the Midwest, doesn't have a ton of great prospects in this class. But again, neither does anyone else. The national safety class is not very good. And you're going to have to find the best of the worst situation. And that doesn't make anyone feel better. And I get it. But at some token, like, you just have to accept what's going on. You're going to keep recruiting KJ Bolden because, again, this is Perry Eliano's family. You have made a healthy NIL offer to him and his family to say this is what's available for you. But if you look at positions like wide receiver, as you said earlier, like, these kids understand they're coming to Ohio State for a different reason. Those wide receivers are choosing Ohio State for a different reason. And part of the biggest issue for the Buckeyes on the defensive side of the ball is that it's hard to point to the last few years and expect kids to buy what you're selling. So maybe things feel different. You get 6 weeks into the season this year and the defense is playing lights out. Maybe kids' eyes open up a little bit different. It's very easy for Brian Hartline, as good as he is, as charismatic as he is, as intelligent, as young, and as, his resume being what it is, to point to kids and say, you can come here, take a little bit less money on the NIL front, and we'll get you to the NFL. It's harder for kids in the secondary or the even linebackers or defensive line. Anywhere on the defense right now has not been very good for Ohio State in the last few years. The NFL draft productivity has declined. Now, you go into this season, you should be able to fix that. You have JT Tuimoloau, you have Michael Hall, you have Tommy Eichenberg, you have players like Denzel Burke and Jordan Hancock, and they're going to see a lot of Ohio State Buckeyes drafted next year on the defensive side of the ball. Will that make the next recruiting cycle easier? Maybe, but no one wants to think about what happens 8 months from now because right now this wound is a little fresh. So I don't know, man. Like, I get people being upset, and I'm drawing some ire and some fire myself. That's fine. I said a month ago I thought Ohio State was going to get KJ Bolden and Dylan Stewart, and I said pretty specifically, like, this is where they lead right now. Things change. It sucks because it feels dismissive to say that, and it feels like, oh well, It doesn't matter if I'm wrong, but I know it does to people, but things do change, and we're living in such a weird time when South Carolina is like paying out the nose for players from the DC area. Ohio State was in that fight. They were not backing off on the NIL front, but then you have to deal with relationships and everything else, and it feels like they're just not getting it done. We can talk about this ad nauseum, Andrew, and I know it feels more like a rant, which is kind of what I wanted this episode of Talking Stuff to feel like, for people to just be able to vent and get this out of the system. But are there questions on the OhioState.Rivals.com message board that we can try to answer?
I mean, honestly, most of the questions that I saw were just kind of pertinent to what we've already talked about. Like, it just seems as though Ohio State will pass on some guys because they think they've got this guy in the bag. The guy that was in the bag ends up committing wherever else. And then the other guy they passed on is, a lost cause at that point, whether it's last cycle with a guy like Desmond Umeozulu, or however you pronounce his name, that committed to South Carolina, wasn't it?
Yeah, from
South Carolina.
Yeah. Nicola Trevor from DC. Weird.
Yeah.
Something.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. You don't push for that one because of Damon Wilson, Keon Keeley, and Mateo Uyunglele, who are all superior players, were all superior players to him. So I get why they did that to a degree, but it's becoming a problem. With this cycle, you've got a guy like Jordan Johnson-Rebel down in Texas, who, from my understanding, was extremely interested in Ohio State, possibly even in committing to Ohio State. And I think maybe they were focused elsewhere, KJ Bolden, people like that, and maybe asked him to not commit to Ohio State. I could be off on that, but I don't know. It just seems like that keeps happening. Guys that you could get that are very good players. And I know there's a gap between a guy like Johnson-Rebel and KJ Bolden, but you look at that gap and look where you're at now, and you're sitting here with nobody outside of the aforementioned Jalen McLean. So I don't know. It just seems like they're in a weird spot, and this keeps happening, and that's problematic.
Yeah, but a guy like Jordan Johnson-Rebel, for example, a perfect example of this. Like, if he wanted to commit to Ohio State and do it publicly after his official visit, they would have said yes. And so this is an example of just one player not having the leverage that KJ Bolden does, for example. So if you're in that position and you're Jordan Johnson-Rebel and you tell Ohio State, man, I'm in, I want to be here, but I'm going to take this visit to Texas next weekend. And Ohio State says, oh, that's cool. No problem. You're in the class. We get it. Enjoy Texas. Then we're having the same conversation about him that we are KJ Bolden or Dylan Stewart, because the odds are he would have still ended up committing to Texas when they offered him more money from an NIL perspective than Ohio State believed he was worth from a valuation standpoint. So unless these kids are, and this is somewhere where I think that Ohio State from a approach standpoint certainly can improve. Like, screw the idea of silent commitments. Like, they don't matter anymore. They never. I mean, they've really never mattered before, but in the world we're living now, where you can be a silent commitment and then leave campus and immediately call the collective of another school and say, okay, well, this is how much they're offering. How much can you offer? Like, that is not, it's not helpful, and it doesn't do anybody any good. And it just makes everyone feel like you're being lied to. And that's a really tough pill to swallow. So I get it, what you're saying, though. This is a situation where Ohio State has been incredibly selective, incredibly picky about which players they're going after on the recruiting front. And because they don't want to kick players out of the class in November. They don't want to take kids who maybe, if Desmond, I don't know, whatever his name is, not easy to pronounce. There's a lot of vowels and a Z and I don't know. If he committed last summer to Ohio State, and again, there's no telling that he would have been willing to publicly do that after an official visit or whatever, which goes back to the point I just made. And then in November, Damon Wilson says, I'm in. Then you have to tell this other kid you're out. Like, that becomes its own ball of wax. Like, are we just circling back to the part I said earlier, where the people in the northern football schools, they're just too nice? They're just doing things too by the book because there are no rules. Why are you driving the speed limit if there's no cops and nobody else on the road? Like, just drive as fast as you want because there's no enforcement anyway.
But that scenario you just mentioned, had Damon Wilson committed, like, Ohio State wouldn't have had to tell Desmond that he's out, because they got nobody at the position group. You know what I mean?
Right. I'm saying, but if the guys they thought they were going to get, two of those three had committed, then you all of a sudden are in a position where, like, okay, now we're over numbers. And so, like, then you have to move. This is, and I don't want to draw the ire too much of Michigan fans, but like this is the old Jim Harbaugh approach, and it seems like he's moving back towards that approach now because he's having a little on-field success at Michigan finally. What he used to do at Stanford was just accept a commitment from anybody who wanted to commit, and then come October, November, December, when they could replace those players with upgrades, you'd see 11, 12 kids decommitting at that point because they were basically being kicked out of the class. And that's a crappy way to do business. But now, is that the way you have to do business now? I don't think that it's black and white, because like you don't want to be those people. You don't want to have to take that approach. But at the same time, like if you don't, you're ending up holding the bag literally for someone else, while South Carolina and Florida States of the worlds and the Auburns come through and say, well, here's X $1 million for a high school junior. Like that's, I don't know. The NCAA is never going to fix this. That's the problem. So Ohio State will have to decide if they want to get on board and start doing things the way everyone else is doing until the NCAA doesn't exist anymore, and these major schools, the major conferences, break away from the NCAA and start their own college football affiliation, which is coming. That is going to happen. But until then, how do you make sure that you're relevant, and how do you make sure that you're winning these recruiting battles if you're playing by the rules that don't exist? And you know, if you're worried about culture, which that part I completely understand. Like I played sports. I understand it matters in your locker room to feel like you're being respected. And some kid from Georgia who has never played a down of college football should not be making more money than the best players on your roster, period. Some kid from Georgia, some kid from the DMV should not be making more money in the NIL space than Marvin freaking Harrison. Okay? Like that's just stupid. So you can let that happen and risk everything else in your program, in your locker room. We saw what happened to Alabama a year ago. It was obvious that they did not like each other the way that Ohio State kids liked each other. Does it matter? I don't know, man.
Another question. Raleigh Buck asked this question. It's a pretty good one. So Jeremiah Smith, again, taking visits. We always talk about Jeremiah Smith for good reason. Probably the best player in the country, regardless of position. But how, with this Florida State resurgence, I guess, how concerned should we be with, and I know he's looking at all three of the Florida schools, but how concerned should we be with Florida State with Jeremiah Smith? And I'm going to add to this question as well. Florida State now has at least 2 Buford players committed. I think they got a running back committed there as well. And I saw they're now being projected to flip some 2025 Buford linebacker who's committed to Georgia. Like, should that make us feel a little bit weird about Edric Houston, a guy like that too, who's thought to be Ohio State versus Alabama? I know that's a different player, different recruitment, but
they're going to ride momentum. Florida State's going to ride the momentum for sure. Jaden Perlotti, the linebacker committed to Georgia, who he visited Ohio State a couple times. Buckeyes really liked him. He committed to Georgia because it's his dream school and the home school. I don't know. I mean, obviously there's going to be shenanigans that are going to take place, and Ohio State will have to find a way to make sure that they protect themselves against it. When it comes to Edric Houston, knowing what I know of him as a person, knowing what Ohio State thinks of him and his family, I don't think that that's a family that you're going to worry too much about the NIL, like huge payoff being something that's going to sway him. Clearly though, they're going to be on high alert for that. So it's not like that being, blinders on or anything like that. When it comes to Jeremiah Smith, he is going to walk into Ohio State in January and immediately be the best receiver on the roster. And the Buckeyes will do everything they can to make sure his career is 3 and out, and it will be as good as Marvin Harrison or anyone else. As long as Brian Hartline is at Ohio State, people don't need to worry about Jeremiah Smith. It's going to be annoying when he shows up at other events. It's going to be frustrating when he pops into Florida or stops in at Miami after saying he's never going to visit their campus again. So it's going to be annoying when he shows up at Florida State for a game or two, but this is just the state of being. And like, it goes back, you have to be willing to compete for these players or you will not compete for these players. So Ohio State is going to allow it. They're going to be as patient as they can and as direct and upfront with Jeremiah Smith about what they expect from him as they can. And as long as Ryan Day and Brian Hartline are at Ohio State and the offense is what it is, then the offense will have Jeremiah Smith in it next year. But there's also like a concern, I think. And this last point, and we're just rambling. So one of the things that would give me pause about the Edric Houston recruitment, and I'm not saying that anyone should worry, is that kids start to feel like, okay, why are the other top defensive players not going there? What's going on here? And so Ohio State will have to fight that perception and make sure that he understands there is a 5-star defensive tackle committed here. There are 2 top 20 linebackers committed here. There are 3 top 15 cornerbacks committed. Like there is a top 15 safety committed. Like it's not as though the Buckeyes are recruiting the 1400th ranked player in the country. Okay, there are schools in the Big Ten who are taking commitments from the 1400th ranked player in the country at this point, and maybe those schools will be proven right and that they're understanding or seeing things better from an evaluation standpoint. But like if you just look at the numbers, like it's not panic time on the defensive front for Ohio State. It feels like it when you lose the top of the top, but it's not a situation where Ohio State is not recruiting, at least somewhat successfully. They do have the number 2 class in the country. They have 19 commitments. And I really still believe Ohio State is in the driver's seat for Brandon Baker. I think Ohio State is in the driver's seat for Jeremiah McClellan. I think Ohio State is still in the driver's seat for Edric Houston. And then you reset the board and you head into the season with 22 or 23 commitments, hopefully under your belt, and you drive forward to find the next 3 or 4 guys in the defensive side of the ball, defensive end, safety, and go from there. Now, does that mean that there won't be more hiccups? There's always going to be hiccups. And I want to leave one thing. I'm going to say one thing here. And Andrew, this will make you happy. I truly believe that after about 6 months of not being involved at all in the recruitment of Jordan Seaton, I think Ohio State is slowly but surely getting back into the position where they can compete with Alabama for Jordan Seaton. So we'll see. I don't know. He's been tweeting a whole lot about South Carolina the last couple of days as well. But he's a kid from the DMV, so you just never know. That's just something to chew on. I do think that there's at least reason once again to be slightly optimistic about Jordan Seaton on the offensive line, which would be if you can add Jordan Seaton and Brandon Baker to this offensive line group, it goes from being one of the best in the country to the best in the country. So there is reason to be optimistic. I get feeling pissed off about the defense, but this is recruiting in the year 2023, and it's never, ever going to be easy again. And I wish it was, but it's not.
So we can try to end this on an optimistic note. A really quick in or out, kind of a 3 for 3. The 3 guys you just mentioned, Baker, McClellan, and then Edric Houston. Would you have Ohio State going 3 for 3 on those guys right now? Or maybe your opinion doesn't matter because you thought Ohio State was getting Dylan Stewart too. So what do you know?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know anything clearly, and that's fine. I do think that as of today, August the 6th, I would say Ohio State lands all 3 of those guys. Now, there is the asterisk especially with Jeremiah McClellan. The interesting thing here is that Missouri allows players to get their NIL money now, like immediately. If that is something that family decides is the most important thing, then that will change things. But, Edric Houston makes his decision in 2 weeks. Ohio State shouldn't feel like they have to worry about him making a visit somewhere else and something untoward happening. This is just about make sure they're winning that relationship between here and August 22nd so that Alabama or Clemson or Georgia doesn't find a way to upend what has been the natural course of that recruitment. Brandon Baker, Ohio State would have loved to have his recruitment over by the end of August. He has announced he's going to take an official visit to Nebraska next month. It's hard to imagine Nebraska being a real contender there. I don't know that there's any real ties. I'd have to look into that, but I think Ohio State's in the position to win it. Justin Fry did a great job. Ohio State would love to get Brandon Baker back on campus for a game, but this is one of those weird situations where the schedule is so crappy in the first 6 weeks of the season at home that you have to wait until like the Penn State game or the Michigan State game before you see any real big visits happening for Ohio State, like the mass visit weekends. So guys like Chance Robinson, guys like Booker Pickett, et cetera, like they're not going to be in town until probably October. So you won't hear a whole lot about them in Ohio State between now and then. So it's going to work its way into feeling like a slow period for Ohio State, but they kind of need it because they need to completely reevaluate the board at defensive end and safety, while just trying to make sure the final pieces on offense get themselves sorted out. I think Jordan Seaton will make an official visit to Ohio State, probably that Penn State game as well. And so that's the one I think people just don't get too dive too far into it right now, but there's at least momentum happening toward a reconciliation of those two sides and him being interested once again in Ohio State.
If Ohio State misses out on Edric Houston on August 22nd, we are going to have to do a pod dressed in just complete. I mean, we're kind of in black today, but complete all black. You can dye your hair jet black. I can wear a black hat or something.
Like Creed on The Office when he uses the printer ink.
Yes. Like we're going to My Chemical Romance concert or something like that. Cause it will be an absolute.
Because trust me, we're not okay if that happens.
That'll be a problem.
Final point. And again, I'm going to try to end optimistically. People can believe what they want. There is still a faction of the Ohio State staff that believes that the Buckeyes are the team to beat for Dominic McKinley. And I've said this since his official visit back in June. I have a very tough time believing it. Some of that has been informed by the perceived naivete of the staff in the last couple months about other things. But I thought it was interesting. There was an article about Dominic McKinley's recruitment the other day where he said that he has an idea of where he's going and that he thinks it will surprise people. And Ohio State wasn't even listed in that article outside of just the name being written. There are people who believe that they are in a much better position there than anyone, including folks like myself in the Ohio State media world, believe. But that's just something to keep an eye on if we're talking about the defensive line as a potential way to salvage some of. Now, he's not the true edge rusher that you're looking for, like a Dylan Stewart. He's similar in size at 6'5", 265 to Edric Houston or the bigger defensive ends, the strong side defensive ends. But if you could find a way to pair Justin Scott, Edric Houston, and Dominic McKinley, that makes a player like Booker Pickett, who is not going to be a true edge and not going to be a true linebacker because he's just such a tweener. If you could find a way to couple those guys together, you might have a really interesting defensive front with that group. But I don't want to get people's hopes up. I'm just saying don't count out Ohio State in that battle. But there are people who think that they're in the driver's seat. I don't personally feel that way, but I've never spoken to the kid because he does not talk to really anyone in the media unless you see him in person. And I've never been to Louisiana to see him. So,
and Booker Pickett unleashed his top 5 or something. Ohio State was on it. We haven't talked a ton about him because of Stewart, Houston, etc. Is he moving up into the priority tier now, would you say?
I don't think he's ever not been a priority. It's just he is an Ohio State legacy. He's just decided that he was going to make his official visits in the fall. And so he sort of took the summer off. And because there's so many kids making decisions in the summer and doing all of this stuff in the summer, it feels like those are the only kids we talk about during that stretch. But Ohio State has loved Booker Pickett. It's just a matter of you don't know where he plays. He's 6'5" and about 197 pounds, and he's not up. I mean, he had 30 sacks a year ago. The kid is an elite pass rusher, but can he tackle a running back? Can he cover a tight end? Can he? You don't know what he's able to do. Is he going to be strong enough to offset a tackle and a tight end comp? You just don't know. So got a lot of physical growth that he has to accomplish before you can really feel confident in where he fits in the defense. But athletically, personality wise, they like him a lot. They really also like his younger brother Cannon Pickett quite a bit, a 2025 offensive lineman. So you could see that all happening. And obviously his cousin DJ Pickett, the number 1 ranked safety in the country in the class of 2025, is a player that they would love. But I don't know. I don't know that it's a matter of them not prioritizing him in the last few months. It's just he's not prioritized recruiting in the last few months. So you'll wait till he starts doing it again the old way. So
got it. Makes sense to me.
Okay. I guess we are done. Thanks for those of you who watched this both times today. The first 6 minutes felt awkward. I just knew something was wrong with my sound, and then it stopped. And then my phone, which is what I use as my camera, folks. If you're a podcaster and you don't use the continuity camera on your iPhone, you're missing out. It's a great quality video. People often ask in the comments, why does Austin's video look so crappy and mine always look so good? because he refuses to adapt and do this approach like Andrew and I do, and like Bill and I do. So if you want to get Austin annoyed, tell him that he needs to start using continuity camera for his podcasting video. So my phone just decided to reset in the middle of that. And so I lost the camera. So we're just glad you came back. Thanks everyone for watching, for listening. Really sorry that the last week has felt a little bit crappy. It's not all, it's not all sunshine and rainbows around here, but Buckeyes have the number 2 class in the country. They do know where they're missing. They do know what they're messing up. And now it's about, let's figure it out and get it right. And, you can call me a sunshine pumper if you want, but I think they're going to get it sorted out. So that's it. Andrew Ellis, Jeremy Birmingham. This has been Talking Stuff on the podcast. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.